Hello, I am here today to do a quick little tutorial on paper dolls, but more specifically, how I use all my stencils for paper dolls and how I use them to create mine. So it seems so intuitive to me, but I can't tell you how many DMs I've gotten about how specifically to create these paper dolls with the stencils. So I thought I really should do a video. So today on Instagram, I did a little 1-minute video, but I thought I would hop on here and have one that's a little bit more extended so people can see things in slow motion and kind of hear me talk about some of the techniques I use. So the first thing I want to talk about is the paper. I just recommend using any kind of watercolor paper. So I tend to use anywhere from like 90-pound to 140-pound watercolor paper. But if it's thinner, it's going to work better. I've tried cardstock, and depending on the technique, cardstock works good too. But if you're doing some of the watercolor effects, you know, where I want some shading and stuff, you really do want to use a watercolor paper because watercolors just blend together on watercolor paper way better than they would on like a cardstock. So just something to be aware of. So I have 3 main methods for creating paper dolls, and they're all kind of in here. So to the naked eye, it just might look like I have a bunch of these figures, but they're actually using 3 different techniques. So I'm going to share those with you. One is with watercolors. Everything is with watercolors. I use watercolors for the whole thing, but the main way to get the stencils going is watercolors. I do one with acrylics, and I do one with using the stencil like a template with a pencil. And what you see here, like this is a stencil template pencil kind of situation. This is also the same thing. These 2 are just watercolors, nothing else. I mean, there's some glitter, but, and then the other one is using acrylic paint. Okay, so we're going to go through all these techniques today. And at first I brought all my stencils over, but honestly, I think I'm just going to use one so you can see the difference between each set, like between each technique. So the first one I'm going to do is a pencil technique. So I just use the cheapo, you know, mechanical pencils that I have for my kids. I don't get anything fancy. And I'm just going to trace through the stencil. Now, one of the things that bothered me when I first started getting into stencils of things is all the little separations, right? Stencils have all these little separations. But as I became a stencil designer, I realized there is a reason for that. It's not just the style, it's those little bridges, they're called in the stencil world. The bridges are there to hold the stencil together, because if this bridge was missing and this bridge was missing and all these bridges were missing, this wing would fall out. And so there's really no way around bridges. They're there to hold the stencil together. And honestly, as time went by, I really kind of got used to the look of bridges. They, you know, they certainly give it a certain look, especially if you're doing like a graffiti style. So I traced my pattern. Now, what I personally like to do is go through and connect all the bridges. You don't have to, because we're going to be going over this. And because the lines in the actual stencil are so thick, I do this because I want people to be able to use acrylic paint or watercolors. It's not like a super thin line. There's some variance in where your pencil will go. It might hug the stencil on one end or the other. So you may find when you pull up your stencil that if you're working with pencil, there may be some variance with your lines. So you just, you know, you can go through and adjust it. Like, it is just a template, so it's there to give you the idea. But if you want a line a little cleaner than how your hand rendered the stencil, you know, you can do that here before you add your watercolors. So this is, I like to call the template style, because you're just literally using the image as a template, but you're modifying it the way you like. So, you know, if your hand did something wonky, you can go through and correct that. And you might say, oh, you know, I want his crown to be way longer. So you can do that. It's entirely up to you. So the template idea gives you a little more freedom in your image. You can modify it however you want. You could say, oh, I'm going to add some hair back here. It's really cool. But once you've got it to where you want it, all you have to do is color it in. So when I'm coloring, I will use a round brush, you know, like nothing too big. I never look at the numbers, but this is a 9, any kind of round brush. And, you know, I just get my watercolors going. And I do try to work quickly, because the irony is, you know, watercolors are a really unique media, and they appear very wet. But in order, and I'm not like the world's best watercolor person at all. I need to go visit my friend April. Why did I say Rachel? April, who sells these watercolors, she's like really good. So in order to get some of the kind of effects of blending and things like that, you really kind of need your watercolors to stay wet. Once they start drying, then you're going to get lines. So you want to constantly blend it in if you're trying to add some darkness in there. You just constantly keeping it wet. That way, when it goes to dry, it will dry a little more evenly than if it's dry in the middle and you're adding this shading. It'll just kind of look a little odd. And again, I'm not like the world's best watercolor artist. So I could go and paint this here, but because this is still wet, it's gonna bleed, which honestly I don't really care about. But for the sake of not trying to frustrate people, I have way too much paint on there. I'm going to go to another section that's not really touching the wings. So I'm going to do his head. And again, I'm just going to kind of go over it a little bit so I know that the surface is totally wet. So I like to add cheeks on everything. So I'm going to add like a darker color where the cheek would be. And the thing about watercolors, okay, is that they're very vibrant. So you can see already this is drying so quickly, even though it starts out with wet, because this paper is porous. So it's not like other papers have a finished surface that kind of keep the wetness on top. Watercolor paper is designed to be absorbent, like a paper towel, but you know, in a microscopic kind of way. Okay, so and when I do these, I don't use too many colors. I try not to go too crazy with the colors, because if I just pick like 1 or 2, it just makes life easier. It just coordinates a little bit. And again, I can't stress this enough. Like, I am not even remotely close to like a professional watercolor artist. I use watercolors all the time, but I am by no means like a great watercolor artist. They're just so fun to use, and so I'm still constantly learning. So I am going through, I'm kind of rereading any dryness, because again, if I want to add another color for some shading and depth, I need it to be wet. Otherwise, it just won't look right. And it dries fast. You'd be surprised. So, and I'm doing this kind of sloppy, right? It doesn't matter because once the watercolor dries, I'm going to be going over it in a like a permanent pen. So I like to use the microns, the Sakura microns. That's what most artists use, but you know, like the ultra fine Sharpie could work, like whatever you like, just anything that is kind of a permanent marker. So like how that's drying. Okay, so I'm going to let that dry and then we'll come back to the doodling. So, sorry, I'm dropping stuff left and right. So I did this technique with this one. And then I went over it with pen. Okay, so it kind of pulls it together and it makes it look a little bit neater. But we're going to let that dry. Now, the thing about watercolors is they are, they dry very quickly, but I want to move on. So the next technique that I'm going to share with you is acrylic paint. So this is another way to get your image stenciled onto your page. So I like to use Dina Wakley acrylic paint. I like it because it's heavy bodied, which means it's very thick, so it's not drippy, right? Not drippy. Some paints are more fluid, so it just makes life easier. And you don't want like a ton of it on your stencil. You can always add more, but if you get too much, I might even have more than I want. You're going to get seepage through the stencil. So just something to think about. So I'm going to put my stencil down and I'm just going to gently go through the stencil. I am using a Ranger Mini blending tool, which has a handle and it has this little Velcro spot for the foam. I really like the mini blending tool, but a lot of, I didn't do the best stenciling, but whatever. Oh, it came out good. But a lot of fine artists will also use like makeup sponges, anything to get that paint through the stencil. You just want to make sure it's like a nice tiny foam. You don't want like a big, you know, like dish sponge or something like that. And I forgot to bring my teeny, oh no, maybe I have one. Oh, I could try with this brush. Usually I would use a smaller brush. So I'm wetting the paint just a smidge. I'm gonna have to be very careful. And again, like if I don't like those bridges, you can go through with your brush and clean some of those up. The stencils are really designed to be standalone so that you don't have to do those bridges. So they're put in a spot where it's not too distracting or anything like that. It just lends itself to this stencil style. But if you want to get rid of them, this is how to do it. You just get the same color paint and you can kind of add them here. Especially like on the beak, it's kind of nice. Okay. So you want your acrylic paint to dry. Oh, I almost put that in my tea. Let me move that. So you're going to let this dry and then you're going to use watercolors. I'm just too lazy to wait for it to dry. Okay, that should be good enough. And then you're going to color it in just like you did on the template. So I'm going to create a different color here. I'm going to try and create my favorite mineral color. So, okay. So I'm going to just go through. And the nice thing about using acrylic and then adding watercolor, is that the acrylic is not water reactive, right? As long as the acrylic is dry, it's going to stay put, okay? And so that's really nice. So I'm just going to add some colors in here that look nice together. Oopsie, I went over that part. Sometimes with watercolor, if you make a little mistake, you can kind of wipe it off a little bit and like push it back to where you want it. Not always. It tends to be very finicky. Okay, so I'm just adding, and it's kind of cool. I've noticed that the acrylic paint sometimes creates a bit of a resist around it, which means like you might get some whiteness around the actual image, which is kind of cool. I get that often too with stamping. So I'm just gonna add some okay. So I'm gonna let that dry. And again, I can come back and add, you know, any kind of doodles that I want or anything like that. So just gonna add one more little color around here. And then again, I can come back and add some doodles, or I can darken the lines a little bit more. So we're gonna let that one dry. And then the last way, I'm gonna do it like this, to use the stencils and create paper dolls is with a flat brush and paint. So let's make a red. I haven't done like a, so you don't want your brush dripping, you know, like I've got paint on there, but it's not like dripping. Once it's dripping, it's gonna bleed. So you want to keep it relatively dry. You also have to let go and realize if you're choosing to use watercolor through your stencils, there's going to be some variation. There may very likely be some seepage, and you just kind of have to let go of your expectations. So there may be some, because I've been using the stencil, but we'll see. Okay, pretty darn good. So I'm going to dry my brush so it's really not too bad, and I'm just going to go through, because I'm sharing, like I'm going to connect the lines a little bit. Again, not necessarily at all, but I'm just showing you, if you want to, you can just go through and kind of pull the paint around. I've got some on my brush here, so, and it's nice because the lines are thick, so like I'm using this flat brush, it's working pretty well. And again, once you start filling it in and doodling, the imperfections go away. So it's all about the doodling. Okay, so I brought my heating tool, which I never use for videos, but I'm going to turn it on so this dries for the sake of speeding things up here. For this technique, you really, really want your watercolor image to be completely dry and like cured, if you will. I highly recommend when you're working with watercolors, once you're done with a stencil, to just kind of gently wipe it off, or even give it a rinse and wipe it off, because when you go to reuse these stencils, like if I go and use some white acrylic paint, it's gonna pick up all this watercolor. So for the sake of using your stencils, I recommend just, if you're using watercolors, rinsing them. All right, so again, up here, I am now going to just use a wet brush. So it's just wet. There's no paint on it at all. And what I like to do is come back in and go along the imagery with watercolor. And I call this reactivating it. So I'm literally using the watercolor that has been cured, and I'm reactivating it to color in my image. Okay. Now you could put paint on your brush, but if you do, you know, you want it to be, you don't want to have a super drippy wet brush, because the more wet your brush is, the more bleeding you're going to get from any detail. So since there's detail in here, you only want to go over it once. You don't want to keep going like this over one spot. You'll just get a big mess. I've only gone over that once. I've gotten it wet to get this kind of batik-y kind of color situation going on. And you can add watercolor to, like, to this technique once it's dry. Like, you can go in and add some color if you want, like I'm doing here. I might do the same for the beak. And because I want it fairly uniform, I'm gonna go along the previous stenciled part and just keep kind of rubbing it with my brush until it blends into my beak. Now, again, this is an entirely different look. It's definitely more of a batik-y look, but there's something to be said about that look. It's really quite beautiful. So, you know, this is another version of that look. And then once everything is dried, you can jazz everything up with your doodles. So, you know, depending on the style, like this style I like by itself. I really wouldn't do much to that. I might add some other color doodles or something. But for the most part, this is a style, this kind of batik-y watercolor-y look. This, to me, his cheek just came out awful, but we'll fix that. So this is different, right? This looks like it needs something. So this is where you come in and you're gonna add your fine art pens. If you don't go over the design perfectly, that's fine, because it just looks more intentional when you do that. Like if you see some of the lines, like if you look, I'm really into illustration. Like I have a lot of children's books. I used to work at a kids bookstore. So I'm inspired by a lot of illustrators. And when you really look at their work and you examine them, you can see a lot of the imperfections. And it's kind of a style on its own. And I'm certainly not saying go out of your way to create imperfections, but I am saying they're just not as important as you think they are. Because if you do it with intention, it looks like part of the design. So now by doing more of the doodling, there's just no way to fix that cheek that I can think of. It just didn't come out well. So, okay. One thing I like to use is paint pens, and I tend to use Posca, all sizes. Someone the other day was like, what size do you use? And I'm like, yes, every single size they make. Pretty much. Okay, that looks a lot better. So again, like this is where you come in and you add your doodles. You could give this person eyelashes. You could give him a line in his beak. You know, I like to add certain doodles that speak to me. So any kind of design work is possible, and collage too. Like these have big open spaces, and I do that on purpose because I'm a doodler and because I'm a collage artist. It really lends itself to adding collage. So, you know, I might create, this is a template style. I did this with a pencil and watercolor. And then I decided to just go over the whole thing with a piece of collage paper and glue it onto the stencil, the whole image. So I do that often. Here's another one, right? So just did collage paper. And then I use the same techniques. I might stick to just coloring things in with the paint pens. I'm looking to see, I don't have, it's funny because like I have a new batch of stuff in here and it's not like, this is one that somebody made me. She used cold pressed watercolor paper, which is a little bumpier, so you can see what that looks like. This is my friend Julie Ann Haas. She did this for me and it looks beautiful. So just different. Oh, here's another one. This one is stenciled with acrylics. So I did this one with acrylics and I left the bridges. I didn't care about those. It's fine. And then I filled it in with watercolors and then I added some more watercolor bits on there. So there's just like a million ways to create these. I'm looking for my, sorry, I have a favorite. Oh great, it's brand new from yesterday, so I have to start it. Okay, I don't want to torture you. I'll pick a different color. Okay. Okay, that one started. Okay, perfect. This is actually better anyway. So I might go through and add some more details. So, you know, the watercolor is just there to get it started. So you have some color on there, and then you can go in and add, you know, paint pens and markers and all that stuff. And the doodles and these colors, they just give it that extra layer. And it draws your eye away from any kind of weirdness from the watercolors. Like this looks a little odd here, how it came out. The cheek kind of blended, so I can like jazz it up. You know what I mean? I can go through and say, okay, that didn't come out the way I wanted. So you just jazz it up with paint pens, you know. You could do some writing in here. You could do some cool stripes. You know, there's like a million ways to go. So that is 3 ways to work with the stencils, 3 different techniques. And you've got some great paper dolls that you can use in your artwork. And, you know, you can just play as you go and have fun with it. So DM me in the comments if you have any other questions about this lesson. And I'm going to be here more often posting lots of stuff like this. So there's definitely more coming.